Paul wrote to the Ephesians, we read in chapter 6, verse 16, that he told them to take up the shield of faith. And he said it was to quench the flaming arrows of the evil one. The Jewish people throughout history have faced evil arrows right from the very beginning. They were persecuted, nations came against them. For the last 2,000 years, they have faced anti-Semitism from even Christians. They have faced persecution, and as we know, they continue to face that today. We read and see reports that anti-Semitism is on the rise throughout Europe and now in America again. And particularly we see the rise in anti-Semitism in the UK. And Jews have experienced anti-Semitism in many forms, but one of the forms they've experienced it in is with regard to Israel advocacy events, where Jewish people go to advocate for Israel, to listen to what's happening in Israel. And they're joined by people like yourself and I, Christian Zionists. And at many of these events, there are demonstrators who gather simply to abuse, intimidate, and shout lies against the Jewish people and ourselves as we go into these events. An example of that was in Edinburgh in August of 2016, where an event called the Shalom Festival was held during the Edinburgh Fringe, and a large crowd of vicious protesters gathered opposite and shouted abuse or for the whole of the day, and played loud music and actually intimidated and frightened many of the people going into the Israel advocacy event. Their rhetoric and their shouting and their abuse was filled with lies, and Jews were called child killers, and there were other phrases and slogans which had no foundation in truth. And the Jewish people have to have faith that God will protect them and be with them. And then there was a meeting in Manchester in October in 2017, where protesters had gathered on the pavement outside the Hilton Hotel, where an Israel advocacy event was taking place. And innocent, respectable people, Jews and Christian Zionists, who entered that hotel to listen to some of the speakers, were jostled and abused and intimidated by this crowd. And what was significant in both these two events is that the police stood and allowed these things to take place. One of the duties of the police is to protect life and property. The definition for a police officer, and I was a police officer for 27 years, is that the duties of an officer is to protect life and property. It says a constable is a citizen, locally appointed, having authority under the Crown for the protection of life and property and the prosecution of offenders against the peace. I was quite shocked at the event in Edinburgh and in Manchester because the police officers didn't protect any of the people entering the events legitimately. They didn't arrest anybody. They didn't stop them chanting. They didn't comply with the hate legislation, and they lost the faith that we should have in the police for them to protect us. The European Forum on Anti-Semitism has this year again published details of a survey throughout Europe of over 7,000 Jews. And the survey asked the Jews how they perceive anti-Semitism in Europe. The FRA also did a survey in 2012, and I've got both of those surveys, and you can get them on the internet if you want to search for them. But what the survey showed clearly was that over 79% of those people surveyed who had been intimidated or been the victims of harassment had not reported those incidents to the police. And their reason was that nothing will change. They've lost faith in the police force. They've lost faith in the organisation who is charged to protect the Jewish people. There are about 330,000 Jewish people in the UK. There are 1.6 million Muslims in the UK, and there are other groups as well, minorities, but the majority say that they're Christian. The small Jewish population, this minority group, has the right to be protected. They have the right to freedom to go into events which support their nation state of Israel. They have the freedom to travel on the buses and trains to these events without abuse. They have the freedom to walk down the street with kippahs and with other religious clothing. They have the freedom to do that. But that freedom is being compromised today because the police are not taking action. They are not being forceful enough with those who would abuse the Jewish people. I think that there is a perception, certainly from the Christian Zionist movement, that the police are there and they are acting, because we see that occasionally people are arrested for anti-Semitic behaviour. But actually, what we've learned from the Edinburgh and the Manchester events is that although people thought they had reported offences, victims had been to the police and said, this has happened to me, that's happened to me. The reality was that those incidents were not recorded, and neither had they been investigated. I, about a month after being at these events, used the Freedom of Information Act to find and bring about evidence to show that the police hadn't even recorded these incidents as crimes and therefore had not investigated them. And since then, I've been with other members of the Jewish community involved in negotiations with the police to try and get them to actually investigate these things properly. Yesterday, I wrote to the National Police Chiefs Council. I wrote to their chair, detailing the evidence that the police had not acted properly and had not protected those going to those events. I've asked that they look at training police officers so that police officers understand the difference between, not the difference, but the correlation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's actually the same thing. And I've asked them to train police officers so that when they hear anti-Zionist chants, they can clearly identify them as anti-Semitic. I've also asked that they retain evidence after these events, video evidence, because they destroyed video evidence after the events in Edinburgh and Manchester, and they say that they're not able to investigate enough of the evidence to bring about prosecutions. So there is issues with faith in the police that they will do things properly. I was in Ireland, Northern Ireland, this last weekend, and people in Northern Ireland, Christian Zionists like you and I, came to my meetings, and I spoke with them, and they told me very clearly that they were frightened in some cases of reporting offences of anti-Semitism, and they were frightened of holding events which would involve Israel activism or advocacy. They were frightened because they didn't feel the police would protect them. And they were frightened that in some cases that the local anti-Israel demonstrators would use subversive tactics to punish them. So they haven't actually got the freedom to carry out the things that God has called them to do. And it's partly because we're not protected. We have to stand with the Jewish people in this situation. When we go to these events, we also become victims of anti-Semitism. But we have to stand with them, and we have to try our best to speak out clearly against anti-Semitism. We have to be brave, and we have to have the faith in God to stand firm and to not be afraid. In 1 Corinthians 16:13-14, Paul says, keep alert, stand firm in your faith, be courageous, be strong. These are very powerful words. You know, as things happen in the UK, as things happen in Europe, which are focused on the Jewish people, we Christian Zionists must be the voice that says no more. No more lies, no more hate, no more intimidation. And if we're able to do that and do that with the faith in God that we have, that will be an example to all that our God, the God of Israel, lives, and he will not close his ears to the prayers of the righteous regarding his chosen. Well, Shabbat Shalom to you all. Hope you have a really good Shabbat. God bless. Mike Fryer.